Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Navigating the Road to Recovery from School Violence. On behalf of the U.S. Department of Education, we are so pleased to have you with us here today. We expect more people to log on shortly. This webinar is a part of our Lessons from the Field webinar series, and this series highlights effective tools, techniques, and strategies employed by everyday practitioners to address hot topics that are on the top of educators' minds. You can access recorded webinars from the series on the webpage, now being shared in the chat. As always, as you participate, if you have additional strategies that are working for your community, please reach out to Best Practices Clearinghouse at ed.gov to share. I just want to start by saying that our work is stronger together and we all benefit from sharing effective strategies. Please note that the content of this presentation does not necessarily represent the policy or views of the U.S. Department of Education, nor does it imply endorsement by the U.S. Department of Education. My name is Janelle Hughes. I'm the project director at the Readiness and Emergency Management for Schools Technical Assistance Center, also known as the REMS TA Center, and I will serve as the moderator for today's event. Let's get started by just providing a little bit of information about the REMS TA Center. We are funded by the Office of Safe and Supportive Schools within the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education. And our mission is to help build a preparedness capacity, including prevention, protection, mitigation, response, and recovery, our focus today, of schools, school districts, institutions of higher education, as well as their community partners at the local, state, and federal level. We offer free technical assistance, asynchronous and synchronous training, publications and guidance documents, topic-specific resources, tools, and more, all designed to support schools, institutions of higher education, and their partners in their efforts to collaborate as they work to develop and maintain high-quality emergency operations plans. I encourage each of you to visit our website at rems.ed.gov and to follow us on social media at REMS TA Center to get up-to-date information on all the resources, training, and tools that we develop and release to the field. We are so excited to partner again with the National Center on Safe and Supportive Learning Environments, or NCSLE. NCSLE's aim is to build the capacity of state education agencies, districts, and schools to make school climate improvements, foster school safety, and maintain supportive, engaging, and healthy learning environments to support the academic enrichment and success of all students. To learn more about NCSLE and to access a range of resources that address school climate and conditions for learning, we do encourage you to visit their website as well. To give you a sense of what that website looks like and the content it contains, we are sharing an image of their homepage right now on the screen along the right. We're also sharing some of their most popular products on the left. Similar to REMS, the NCSLE also shares their latest resources and events coming out from the field via social media, so please make sure that you follow them as well. A quick note, please note that this webinar is being recorded. All materials that you see today, including the slides, the reference resources, and the recorded version of the webinar, will be available on NCSLE's event webpage. Some items, including the slides and speakers' bios, have already been posted to the site. Please note that you can also access our previous Lessons from the Field series webinars by visiting the webinar series webpage, which is also listed here and will be posted in the chat. So now that we've provided a brief overview of who we are, I do want to just quickly run through our agenda. We'll start, as always, with some introduction and logistics and a welcome. We'll then turn things over to our context setting presenters. And then we'll dive into our panel discussion with all of the lovely panelists that we have here today. We'll then close with some key takeaways for everyone to keep in mind, and then we'll engage in a live Q&A session. Again, we really welcome and encourage you to post any questions for both our context setting presenters and our panelists using the Q&A feature that you see via your Zoom control panel. It is my pleasure to now introduce Kayla Patrick, Policy Advisor within the U.S. Department of Education. Kayla, over to you.
Thanks so much, Janelle. On behalf of the U.S. Department of Education, I am pleased to welcome you to our latest Lessons from the Field webinar, Navigating the Road to Recovery from School Violence. This is the fourth webinar in the Preventing and Addressing School Violence mini-series, a mini-series that is focused on sharing evidence-based and promising practices to prevent, prepare, respond, and recover from incidents of school violence. To promote school safety, we need to ensure that all schools are safe, positive, supportive learning environments where every student feels a sense of belonging and receives the support they need to fully engage in school every step of the way. Although we know we can't prevent every incident of violence in schools and the surrounding communities, it is critical to keep a focus on creating this safe, supportive, and nurturing school climate and prepare for emergencies by having a strong emergency operating plan, practicing drills, and improving practices focused on enhancing safety. When incidents of violence do happen, especially those involving serious injuries or deaths, we know the entire school community is impacted. Survivors, including school personnel, students, and families, experience a range of emotions and reactions as they process what happened and begin the recovery journey. The recovery journey is complex, and it requires supporting staff, students, and families with a variety of school and community approaches based on individual and collective needs of those impacted by the incident and how those needs evolve over time. In this particular webinar, our speakers will share the trauma-informed recovery strategies for rebuilding a safe, supportive school climate, as well as the resources to assist in the recovery journey following an incident of school violence. We will begin with 2 brief presentations on trauma-informed practices and strategies to support recovery, then a panel of practitioners who have experienced school violence directly or worked with schools after incidents of violence. They will share how school personnel and students can navigate recovery. As we proceed with today's webinar, we know you will hear valuable information and strategies that you will be able to use in your schools and districts, and as you develop emergency operating plans and/or when recovering from the unfortunate incident of school violence. We also know the content of this webinar may be heavy and at times potentially activating. Please participate as you are able. Thank you again for joining us today and for your efforts in creating safer environments in your schools and communities. Now I would like to go back to Janelle to introduce our context-setting speaker.
Thank you so much, Kayla. I am happy to introduce our 2 context-setting speakers today, Dr. Jennifer Freeman, Crisis Coordinator with the Center on PBIS, also Associate Professor at the Neague School of Education within the University of Connecticut. We are also happy to have Dr. Marlene Wong joining us today. She serves as CEO of the Center for Safe and Resilient Schools and Workplaces based in California. So with that, I am going to turn things over now to Jennifer to get us started.
Thanks, Janelle. It is my job to spend the next couple of minutes setting the context for today's conversation. And so I want to start by sharing a little bit about what we know about what that road to recovery looks like. And the last 2 webinars in this mini-series talked about what that impact and rescue phase looked like. So today's conversation is really around these next phases: heroic, disillusionment, and reconstruction. And so I want to focus a little bit on what those look like so that you know what to anticipate as you go through a recovery. So often during that heroic phase, what many communities experience is a high level of social cohesion. There's a high level of external support. The community has come together to support each other and is really actively engaged in meeting each other's daily needs. It's often during that time that schools reopen. And so it's because of that this is the time period that we really talk about as the beginning of recovery within a school setting. Following that, we often see a number of teachers that are able to maintain that level of energy and focus really through till the next school break. So maybe that's Christmas break, maybe that's summer break, but we see teachers kind of push through, really focused on supporting their children with high levels of support during that time. Following that, though, the adrenaline and some of that external support often wears off. And it's during that time that it can become really challenging in schools as the community starts to grapple with what the ongoing needs are and sort of the overall scope of the incident. That phase may also coincide with the start of the next school year or may include the start of the next school year, and it often can catch people by surprise because people may be anticipating that we got through the initial recovery and now things will feel a little bit easier, and often it feels harder instead. But eventually that disillusionment phase moves into that longer term recovery phase where the community becomes empowered to move towards resilience and healing. It's really important to remember, though, that all of the timelines and guidelines on that previous slide are just estimates, and that there are lots of things that will impact your community's road to recovery and make those timelines differ. Existing systems of support might facilitate recovery, and we also know that staff and students who were previously struggling before an incident are likely to need increased support. So there's a lot of variability in what this looks like across communities. What we do know, though, is that while some students in sport will need ongoing treatment and support, the overwhelming majority of people move towards resilience. And that the overwhelming, most common outcome for individuals is resilience. As we've worked over the last 10 years or so to support school recovery, both short and long-term in districts, we've started to identify some key action steps and priorities for each area of recovery. It's sometimes hard in the wake of a crisis to know where to focus. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of key lessons from these phases today. So first, we think about organizing recovery supports within a multi-tiered framework. So within this framework, we use data to support decision-making, systems to support staff, and practices to support students. And within the recovery context, there are a couple of pieces of this framework that we've really learned are important to emphasize. First, the days and months following a crisis incident are not the time to try to do a bunch of new things. Your district's typical capacity to adjust and change is going to be really limited as everybody's energy is directed toward healing. So this is the time to really lean into systems of support. Many districts find that they need to increase staffing and resources, at least temporarily, to meet the needs, therapeutic and educational, within their district. And while recovery planning is directed and organized by your district leadership team, most districts have found it really helpful to establish a recovery coordinator position that can help manage the logistics and guide recovery in all of the things that are above and beyond the everyday running of a district. That person can also help support the development of a written recovery plan. We've learned that there are a lot of well-meaning supports out there, and after a crisis incident, your district is likely to be approached and asked to consider a wide range of new practices related to safety or trauma recovery or mental health. This is the time to make sure that any new practice that you consider adopting is evidence-based and is truly aligned to. That's where that written recovery plan can be really helpful. Districts that have a written plan in place can more easily communicate what you're doing to facilitate recovery rather than just adopting new practices. And then finally, we know that the range of data that your district will need to guide include multiple sources. So things like triage for exposure to trauma, screening for mental health symptoms as you move into later phases of recovery, and then using things like attendance, behavior, course performance to monitor student well-being, as well as school climate surveys and student feedback. And then fidelity data for any new practice that is implemented to make sure that it is done consistently and correctly. This slide just provides some additional detail on what a recovery coordinator position might look like. It includes a link to an example provided by Oxford, Michigan. It's a really excellent example of what their recovery coordinator position looked like. And it also includes a draft of a working recovery plan. This is a work in progress that we've used to support district planning. So if you're looking for a written guide for either of those two things, you've got some links in this slide here. Oops, going too fast. Within a multi-tiered framework, we use a public health model to think about how do we organize practices. And this model helps us think about what are the supports that are needed for everybody, and what are the supports that are needed by a few, and then who are the people and in what areas do they need intensive individualized support. And after a crisis, it's often important to think about how do we intensify the supports that are provided to everyone in order to support recovery. So there are things that these are things that your school is likely already doing to some extent, but that are important to really intensify and focus in on to help foster resilience after an event. So I want to give you a couple of examples of what those look like. So for example, building connections and relationships is critical all the time. It is especially important after a school disruption and after a critical incident, because connections and relationships are severed in that moment. So it becomes really important as a school community to focus on reestablishing those connections to make sure that all students and staff are welcomed and feel connected in the school environment. Schools do this in a lot of different ways, but a lot of schools choose to do things like intentionally focusing on greeting all students at the school door or the classroom door, or developing a staff buddy system to make sure that staff have somebody to check in with over the course of the school day. Another area that we can intensify after an incident to support all students and staff is to reestablish routines. Routines help us recover by establishing a sense of predictability. Getting back into the classroom and reestablishing classroom routines really does help facilitate healing. That said, there are likely a lot of new routines and procedures that need to be in place after an incident, and making sure that we really explicitly teach and practice those routines can help students feel a sense of safety. This is also a really important time to reteach and reinforce your school or classroom expectations. Students may have a wide range of behaviors as they process their emotions following an event. And it's really important that we explicitly teach them how to express those emotions in a safe and respectful way that facilitates healing. Many schools choose to clarify their expectations and what they mean in different school environments using something like this matrix. The matrix can also be expanded to help teach students what to do if they need to ask for help during the day. So we can directly teach students, if you start to feel overwhelmed, these are ways you can reach out for extra support during the school day following an incident. And then finally, we know that all students and staff are likely to be experiencing a really wide range of emotions that can feel really overwhelming and make it difficult to get through the school day after an incident. So we can intentionally focus on teaching and practicing some key emotional regulation strategies, things like breathing exercises or emotional regulation using physical movement. And by teaching these strategies to everyone proactively, we can give students the tools they need to begin to process their emotions before they become completely overwhelmed, and make it more likely that they're able to successfully re-enter the classroom environment. So those are things that we can intensify for everybody after an incident. And we know that that will help reduce some of the more intensive needs in your building, but your school or district will also need to plan to adjust those supports based on the needs of your staff and students. There are a lot of ways to do this, but the general idea is that if you can predict that a situation is going to be challenging for some students, then you can consider ways that you could change the situation or provide additional supports. And you can do that proactively to help students maintain their path to recovery. Schools do this in lots of different ways. Some use apps, some use paper and pencil, but the idea is some form of a regular student check-in can help schools identify when those adjustments might need to be made proactively. One of the most common questions we hear from teachers after an incident is, when and how do I return to academics? Sometimes there's pressure from states around state testing, but it's a really challenging question to answer, and there is no real good answer. The answer is it depends. But generally, you want to start by reintroducing academic routines at an independent level. And that's because students, when they first return back to school, are readjusting to new routines and being in community again. And their time and energy, cognitive energy, is focused on that. Once we kind of move into that phase where that starts to feel routine again, we can start to slowly increase the academic rigor, but we're going to do that while we monitor student response. So then you're going to watch their response, and you can adjust the level of rigor, you can adjust your pacing, or you can adjust your level of support to help your students move forward with their academic as well as emotional recovery. And then just a couple of final thoughts on these later stages of recovery. The disillusionment phase can be really challenging. We found that it is helpful to normalize this for your staff by letting them know that others have found that return to the second year or a return after a break during this phase to be really challenging. And that way they're not surprised by some of what they see, and they can prepare to increase their levels of support for each other and their students. During this intermediate phase, it's really important to keep focused on staff and student engagement, and that's both within school and within the community. Thinking about how do we get people connected to each other, because we really heal in community with each other. Thinking about, as a district and as a team, intentional ways to foster a sense of purpose for people, that sense of connection, and a sense of hope. And then this is also the time to really work smarter and not harder, and lean into looking for efficiencies so that we can help reduce the number of things that are on each individual's plates as we go forward. And it's just really important to remember that recovery really is a long-term process, and districts will need to continue to adjust and monitor as this process moves along. In general, districts in this long-term phase need to think about planning for ongoing supports for the most impacted staff and students. So you will have a cohort of staff and students that were more directly involved that will need long-term support. In general, districts need to plan to provide some level of ongoing follow-up or communicate a need for support for staff or students who leave the district. And then consider ways to develop procedures for honoring deceased. That often involves a lot of listening sessions and feedback from the community about what's meaningful and helpful to facilitate. And then continue to use that MTSS framework to help guide the work across time. And at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Janelle.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I just was taking notes as you were speaking and want to highlight a few quick points: using data to support decision-making and to differentiate support, building those connections, reestablishing those routines. I think one of the most powerful things you mentioned is that there are phases of recovery. So there's immediate, short-term, and long-term. And we'll hear in a minute from one of our panelists about how they're still providing some supports even 2 years after one particular incident. I am so happy now to turn things to Dr. Marlene Wong to continue our context setting presentations. Marlene, over to you.
Okay, thanks so much. And I just want to say what an excellent presentation. I think every word for me rang true. And I just want to say that I'm speaking now from the perspective of having been one of the people that the U.S. Department of Education called upon for some of the earlier school shootings. And I have continued to work with several of those sites of tragedy, including most recently in Parkland. So let's start right out with a brief introduction of myself. I was the former director of mental health, the crisis teams, the threat assessment teams, and the suicide prevention programs for the Los Angeles Unified School District for many years. I kind of grew up professionally in schools, so K-12 is just everything that has been a part of my working life. One of the other aspects of it is that this presentation is going to focus just briefly on how do we apply that excellent presentation and all those great guidelines that Dr. Jen provided. And I just want to say, after school shootings, and especially where many lives were lost, in Parkland, 14 children were killed, 3 adults were killed, and 17 others were shot and wounded. And those people will tell you that they will never recover. It's not a word that they use or accept. The person that they lost, their 14-year-old child, there's a void in their hearts, in their families, in their lives, and they struggle with it. They struggle with it at some time during a day. There have been news stories of people who have experienced school shootings more than 30 years ago. And this has changed the culture of education. The fact that we're not on this webinar talking about math and science and STEM, we're talking about safety and survival. And every child who was born after 1984, they know what a school shooting is because they were 5 by the time when they were 5 and went back to school. It was in the middle of that initial pre-Columbine spate of school shootings in many rural and suburban areas across the country. If you were born before 1984, you didn't know what a school shooting was. It didn't happen frequently. There was no news story. I remember talking to a newspaper person, the LA Times, and we were talking about the need, why we had developed the crisis intervention teams back in 1984. And he said, well, okay, but education isn't really a big area in our paper. It represents way less than 20% of all news stories. So think about what we're living in, the media environment that we're living in today. People will tell you, and I will depend on that excellent. I'm looking forward to the panel and hearing from them on their firsthand experiences. But from the people I've heard from, every new school shooting not only brings back terrible memories, in many ways, it makes them relive what they experienced on that tragic day. One of the things also that is very concerning, but is real, is that there are deaths of despair. So school districts need to be serious in getting mental health folks into the school, and that assessment that Dr. Jen talked about. How are children doing? How are the adults doing? That there's information and support services for them, because there have been suicides after every school shooting. One of the things I want to say is that the environment has changed as well. When I sat down with the superintendent of Jefferson County Schools after the tragedy at Columbine High School, we sat down, there were 3 of us, the superintendent, the undersecretary of education, and me, over dinner, and we talked about just quiet conversation, what is needed, how has this affected your students, your teachers, the parents, and what can we do to help right now to create a trauma-informed recovery program for your whole school family. So fast forward to Newtown. And again, I was asked to be at dinner with the superintendent, but this time it was the superintendent, every state commissioner in the state of Connecticut, 6 law enforcement folks, FBI, state and local, as well as school law enforcement, and 4 lawyers, 2 that were local and 2 that were national school safety experts. So there's also things that we don't anticipate. I mean, there's so much going on, but also at many of these schools, the superintendents may change. Some don't change, a small percentage, but they may change up to 5 times within a short period of time in 3 years. They move in and out because things get politicized. And also, not only the superintendents, but principals and faculty members may depart. So you've got fewer people at the leadership level, at the school and at the district level, who really, who are more distant in their understanding of the terror that children, adolescents, adults experienced on that day. I've been there when threats have come through the superintendent's office, people telling them that they're targets, they're going to be killed. And I just want to say there are people from all over the country. They come out, there's just these fringe elements, and they say it didn't happen. They threaten the lives of people. They get their home numbers. And this is something where increased security is very important during this period of time because people can't work under those stressful conditions. And the last part of it is have a budget for a warehouse because people from all over the country will express their care and concern in ways that you might not expect. I've heard stories where, you know, their clothes are sent, used clothing, shoes. One person even talked about how someone cleared out their freezer and sent it to the school so that when the folks at the school got it, it was like this moldy, wet mess. I don't have time for a lot of resources, but I just want to say that specific to violence recovery, the Principal Recovery Network is something that you can access online. It's 21 principals who are committed to help guide principals in the early days after a school shooting. Oops. And I want to just highlight two principals. One is Frank D'Angelo, who is an amazing man. And he wrote a very important book, which is They Call Me Mr. D. And I would encourage you, if you really want to know what it's like for a principal to deal with tragedy, he writes down, he created a safe place in the midst of one of the, first really large scale school massacres. And I'll tell you, parents use the word murder and massacre. They don't use the word school shooting. And also the current principal of MSD High School in Parkland, Michelle Kefford. And these are some of the things that they have to deal with. Unexpected secondary crises and adversities. And that is that we might not be aware. It's sort of like, an iceberg. We might not be aware of many of the challenges or even trauma histories that students might have or faculty might have. They're survivors too. Maybe they're survivors of child abuse and neglect. Maybe they're survivors of sexual abuse. Maybe they've been victims of gun violence. Conflict resolution. So our picture is going to be of the students who died, of the faculty who died. Are they going to be allowed on campus? Are they going to be in the front office along the front hallway? There's some folks that are very insistent. Yeah, they need to be there. So these conflicts that come out of care and love still need to be resolved. They had to deal with the political aspects of it. One is the political activism of the memorial foundations. Many of them have a legislative arms and have really advocated for stronger safe school laws and safe school funding. But there's also, political people in office who have come to the school who want to walk through the building where the shooting, the massacres, the murders took place. And some of them at Parkland have been Secretary of Education, the director and the, assistant director of the FBI, as well as the Vice President of the United States and many superintendents from across the country. Michelle will say she will never do have a program without school mental health assistance. And she's created this very close relationship with Lisa Wobbe-Veet, a school social worker. And together they make decisions about the programs, the interventions. They even sit down and talk about individual kids and their needs. So I just want to say it's more complex than we can even understand. It's hard to wrap your head around what these two individuals have done, but I really do encourage you to read Frank's book. So what's happened next? There's a story. I said I was going to tell a story of three cities in regard to this, and one is, of course, Littleton, Colorado. One is Newtown and Sandy Hook, Elementary School, and the third is Parkland. So these are the children and the faculty who were killed on that day. These are beautiful, heartbreaking pictures of these young folks whose lives ended on February 14th, 6 years ago. And I guess if I were to think about, what's our take home in this is that, yes, it is possible to recover. But it's a very difficult journey. And whether or not they have siblings in the school, these young people who died, the families live in a community. They see each other every day on the streets and in stores, and that we have to support them for as long as they need support, because there is no timeline for recovery, as Dr. Jen said. And it is possible. And the mothers and fathers of these children, they may never recover, but they will and have gone on to live meaningful, productive, generous, and giving lives. But they do it with a heart that's broken. So thank you so much for your time and attention.
Thank you so much, Marlene. I think this is really truly the perfect segue into our panel discussion. I know that our panelists will cover a lot of what both you and Jen just shared. So with that, I do want to welcome our panelists. Thank you all for joining the discussion today. We're so happy to be joined by Nnamdi Chukwucha, who is the state representative from the state of Delaware, and he is the Community Schools Director for Children and Families First. We also have Bridget Gilbert, a School Emergency Management Coordinator with the Maine School Safety Center. Nikki Henderson, who is the Director of Recovery Services at Uvalde Consolidated Independent School District in Texas. Heather Martin, an educator at a rural high school. She is a lived experience expert. She was a student at Columbine High School. She's also the co-founder of the Red Bulls Project based in Colorado. And we also are joined by Jeffrey Upton, Assistant Director of the Maine School Safety Center. So again, thank you so much to each of you for joining the conversation today. If we can have all of our panelists join us on camera, we will get started with our panel discussion now. I am going to start this conversation with Heather. You were a senior, Heather, at Columbine High School when the unspeakable tragedy took place. And in many ways, as Jen and Dr. Marlene shared, Columbine really sparked in some ways a renewed focus on school safety and security. We weren't hearing too much about school shootings before then. And we talk a lot about that in our work. So another part of the conversation to consider is that recovery pathway for that school community. And as Marlene mentioned, recovery sometimes is the long-term and lifetime experience. So can you talk to us, Heather, about how you navigated that recovery journey and how that experience and other incidents of violence in your community inspired you to found the Rebels Project?
Sure. Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here and to share what I have learned in the 25 years since the shooting at Columbine High School with you all. Just a little bit of a background of where I'm coming from and the lens that I view my responses through. I was a senior the year of the shootings at Columbine, and I was a physically uninjured survivor. So I think that that is important to note as I respond to some of the questions. I am also a high school English teacher now, and we experienced a shooting in 2021 where 6 students were shot. So I've also survived one as a teacher. That shooting is not technically categorized as a school shooting because it was across the street, so it wasn't on school property, but it was the perpetrators were students, and while we didn't have any deaths, 6 students were physically injured. So as I kind of answer these questions, just know that's sometimes I'll be answering or thinking about what it was like after the shooting at Columbine, and then also as a teacher and experiencing it at Aurora Central High School. I'm pretty much just going to validate the excellent presentations and the things that people have already said. in that the first weeks after the shooting at Columbine High School, there was sort of that heroic phase where the community was coming together and everyone was saying, we are all Columbine and we are all one. And I also want to point out that as a survivor, that was infuriating. I was so mad at people saying we are all Columbine, because it was like, we are not all Columbine. You weren't there. You don't know. So because of trauma, anger is one of the first responses. And that was really heightened for me as a 17-year-old because, hormones in the first place, but also experiencing the trauma. So it just made me really mad when people would talk about that and at community events. And I felt really not included because I was a physically uninjured survivor. So it kind of gives that idea of, make sure that we're acknowledging everyone's experiences and what everyone goes through when an event like that happens. Similarly, the shooting at Aurora Central High School not being acknowledged or as a school shooting or not even making any kind of headlines or anything. I mean, I think it was on CNN as like a blip, but that was only because it was in Colorado, which is unfortunately experienced its fair share of mass shootings. So not being acknowledged in that sense either really brought back that feeling of anger and kind of reactivated all those feelings that I had as a student. And now I was as a teacher in a leadership position. We mentioned that recovery is not linear. There's no timeline. I still have reminders that I am not immune to April, which our shooting occurred on April 20th in 1999. And pretty much every April, I struggle. I struggle in different ways, and it definitely gets better. Like, I don't want people to think that, just life is going to be hard for the rest of your lives. It certainly gets better, but, I still have rough years, and this year in particular being kind of one of those 25-year mark that people like to, I don't know, emphasize, was really rough. And after I graduated as a senior, we didn't have that sense of community going off into the world. So I hate using any kind of comparative language because it's not like a competition. It's not about who suffered more or struggled more, but the students who went back to that school after the shooting for years following, they had a community and they had people that knew what they had gone through. And the seniors, we did not have that. So in college, I struggled a lot. I lost my mind during a fire drill and just started crying, but nobody knew that I was at Columbine because I didn't want anyone to know, because I was worried that because I wasn't shot, that people would be like, why are you freaking out about this? It's no big deal. Like, you weren't in the library, you weren't shot, like all of these things. So that sense of community is critical in the aftermath to help build that resilience and to foster resilience. And I just call it my recovery journey. I will never be recovered, but it's an ongoing journey. I did eventually drop out of college. I developed an eating disorder. I started dabbling in drugs. Just, I want to say like textbook stuff, but it kind of was. And I didn't want to acknowledge it because I was like, no, that's just what people do in college. I kept coming up with all these excuses for why I shouldn't be traumatized or why I shouldn't be feeling the way that I was. And basically 10 years later is when I got invited back into the school. Frank DeAngelis, the principal, I love that man, invited the class of 99 back to the school. And so we were able to reconnect and be together and not feel abnormal. Like, everyone else was struggling too. And suddenly I had a community again. We formed the Rebels Project, named after the Columbine Rebels, after the shooting at the Aurora Theater, because we wanted to provide what we did not have access to in 1999, which was people who got it, people who understood, people who wouldn't judge what we were feeling and would know why we were angry. Now we are one of the largest peer support networks in the United States. We also support members from internationally from various mass trauma events, not just school shootings. Going strong, fortunately and unfortunately. We are, welcoming new members all the time, and We have not only a private online space, but we are invited to communities to visit, to speak with the community and survivors and just kind of give words to people who are struggling and may not know why they are still struggling. I think that's kind of like a really broad overview, but just to say that really everything that was in those presentations is pretty spot on.
Thank you so much, Heather, for being here and for your willingness to share your story and for your transparency. We'll definitely be continuing this conversation. I do want to turn things to Nikki now. Nikki, I know that shortly before the active shooter situation at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas, you spent nearly a week working at the school as a licensed professional counselor. And so you were familiar with the climate of the school and the community. How would you say your role and your perspective shifted as you supported the school community with recovery and the aftermath within?
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the question. I would like to first just to say to Heather, it's wow. Thank you for your comments. Listening to you as a survivor has made me think of some things that I had not really considered before, and Jennifer and Dr. Wong as well. I have to agree with Heather. The information you've shared has really been spot on, and we're noticing almost everything point by point that you've mentioned here in Uvalde. So yes, I am a licensed professional counselor, and at the time of the shooting, I was one of 5 licensed mental health professionals employed by the school district, and each one of us had an assigned campus, and Robb happened to be my assigned campus. And I actually was on that campus 4 days a week for 2 years prior to the shooting. And so I knew that staff well. I knew the students very well. I provided both individual and group support on that campus on a regular basis. And so when Robb happened, to go from supporting one campus, one set of students, one set of staff members, to then transitioning to the support of an entire school district, which included 750 staff members and nearly 4,000 students, felt pretty overwhelming. You know, when you live in a community that has a total population of just over 15,000 people, we are a rural school district. We're 75 miles away from the next nearest city, which is San Antonio. There was virtually nobody unaffected when you lose 21 individuals. Just within our own school district, we had parents who lost their children. 2 of our own teachers lost their children in the shooting. One of our counselors lost her niece. We have grandparents, aunts and uncles, countless siblings in our district who suffered tremendous loss that day. And in terms of those of us working for the school district, we were then faced for the first time with the really unique circumstance of being not only the mental health providers, but victims as well. We had relationships with these kids. Again, when you live in a town like Uvalde that is small, and there are generations of families that live here, we've got teachers who are now teaching the children and grandchildren of some of their very first students. So we know each other well and the connections are strong. And so the need was really high. And we knew as mental health professionals that we were not initially in the right headspace to be the best support for others. And so we really depended on community partners, a lot of different individuals who came forth to help us in those early days. We knew that as the mental health providers, we needed to accept that support and prepare ourselves to go on and support the rest of the school district. So it was pretty overwhelming in the beginning, but we were very, very thankful for the support of others that we received.
Thank you so much, Nikki. And I know that support is so important when you're talking about school-based incidents of violence. As Heather and both Nikki have shared, but we also know that community-based incidents can also impact schools the whole school community. So we're not just talking about students and staff, but as we mentioned, families and others. So we know that our partners here from the Maine School Safety Center can attest to the impact of community-based incidents of violence on schools as they supported schools with recovery following the 2022 active shooter incident in Lewiston. So Bridget, I do want to turn things to you, and I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about the types of supports that schools and districts were seeking from your safety center and other state partners in the aftermath of the incident, and what were you hearing from school leaders at that time?
Yeah, the shooting in Lewiston, Maine last October really forced school administrators to take a step back and look at their emergency operations plan. I think before the shooting, some people had the mindset that it just couldn't happen here because it hadn't, and Maine was always pretty much exempt. I could tell, that administrators were truly afraid for their students. They were afraid they were going to make the wrong decision. They were afraid of the unknown. The shooting and the fact that the shooter was still at large rattled and really terrified everyone. Administrators wanted to do everything they could to protect the students. And even though administrators thought they were in a good place with their emergency operations planning, this incident caused some doubt. And so they had reached out to us to ask us to review their emergency operations plans, including annexes. But because the shooter was still at large and was for days, the biggest concern that they had was whether to hold school. And if they did, should they have recess? Should they have after school activities? So the guidance that we gave them was to connect with those multidisciplinary teams that they have when they put together their emergency operations plans. There's law enforcement on the teams. They would have more connections as far as, what the risk was. And, they had to take their demographics into consideration as well. But it would be a team making the decision instead of, just a couple of people making the decisions. So it would be, more comfortable. And we also suggest, that if they are going to be outside and they are within those demographics to, add more staff outside to help supervise. And that would make, help make parents feel better too. But schools were looking for answers to questions that we just didn't have the answers to. It was probably a few days before we even were able to confirm that there were students that were shot. We had basically what the press had and what they were giving out. And so we were basically telling schools just to do what they thought was best based on the information that they had. And like I said, their demographics. And Maine is a local control state, meaning that state DOE does not tell schools how to respond to incidents. But people were generally afraid of making the wrong decision, and I don't blame them. This really awoke many feelings in people that they probably didn't think they would ever have to feel. And I guess I was kind of feeling the same way too. But I could hear it in their voices and I could see it on their faces that people were anxious and they were terrified. And not just people in schools, but people in the community too. And there was constant media coverage and people were constantly talking about it. And even though, those who weren't there, they were still traumatized. So from the Maine School Safety Center, standpoint, we attended the superintendent's conferences the next day to be on hand in case anyone wanted to contact us. They gave us a private room to have these conversations in. Our team held virtual office hours. Dr. Karen Barnes, who runs our behavioral threat assessment program, was probably the busiest out of all of us just to try to help with those mental health supports for staff so that staff could better help the students. We worked closely with the Maine Fusion Center to try to get the factual information. It was very confusing from the start, and we didn't really have a lot of information to give out. And, we had to navigate rumors too. And that was, that made it even more confusing, honestly. So we sought guidance from other professionals who have, you know, either been through this before or had some suggestions on how we can recover from this. And that is actually when I first met Dr. Jennifer Freeman. So thank you. And we attended meetings with schools and other partners to process through their plans and what their options were. We shared resources that the governor's office and REMS TA had given us. And we attended after action meetings with our department and with our school safety specialists, you know, and just like when you do you have a drill or an exercise, you always do an after action report and the lessons learned, and you do the same thing when something happens in your community. And we offered, you know, like I said, the mental health resources, and we formed a recovery support team. And just recently we formed a school emergency management advisory committee to discuss the current events, our school safety specialist program that we have, and, you know, anything else that comes up. And during our after action meetings with some administrators, we learned that they didn't really know what they needed or what they wanted for guidance, but they wanted to hear from the safety center more, and they wanted that to be really unsolicited. And the Maine School Safety Center has only been formed for maybe 4 years. And we're part of Maine Department of Education. And, you know, there were lessons that we learned, and we're able to, you know, make changes to make our response better too. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bridget, for all that you did during that time and all that you continue to do. And Jeff, I know that you work closely with Bridget now, but at the time you were actually serving in the law enforcement role. Can you speak a little to the added value of building those connections in advance and having those law enforcement partners who really understand student development, and why it's important for SROs and others to really have that familiarity with the school and the school community?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yes, now I work with the safety center. Prior to this, I was a police officer and a school resource officer for over 20 years. And when the Lewiston event happened, I was in administration in the police department. And our department is probably about an hour, 20 minutes south of Lewiston. So we weren't right there in the community, but Maine's a big, small state. So we were there, we felt it. And how we handled it down at this end was the superintendent was calling saying, what do we do? And honestly, he was calling me because he knew I had a relationship with the safety center. And he goes, DOE's not telling us what to do because, again, we're a local control state, like Bridget had said. So we truly believe in the schools make the decisions. We want them to have all the power, and we're here to help advise. But we didn't know how to advise at that point. So he was calling me saying, what do we do? We don't know where the perpetrator is. We have no idea. In Maine, we have a lot of woods. He could be in the woods. He could be anywhere in the state after a day or two. So his concern was, do we have school? Do we not have school? Now, the law enforcement officer, the cop in me said, shut it all down. It's the safest for us. You just shut it down. We don't have to worry about it. His argument, which, because I'd worked with him for many years and worked in schools, his argument was, kids need support. They might not have the support at home, or maybe they need more support than they can get at home. So I want to bring him, because he's in this job because he loves students, right? He loves kids. He wanted to be that protector as well, which is, I think, one of the reasons he's such a fabulous superintendent. So he wanted the kids there to make sure they have the supports they needed. And again, the cop side of my brain said, absolutely not. I can't provide security for all your schools and make sure the kids feel safe. But the SRO side of me said, you're absolutely right. Because as an SRO, I would want the kids there with me so that I can see them, I can interact with them, I can have those conversations. So ultimately, that's what we decided to do. He kept the schools open. We provided as much extra security and visibility as we could provide. A small town, we have 7,000 in the town, where we're a district that shares with a couple of other towns. So we did the best we could to get officers in, but in a situation like that, law enforcement responds well too. So they understood we're going to bring the kids in, and we're going to be there for them. And we were able to do that because of the relationship, because of the trust we have with our school district. And I think that's the biggest piece. Understanding student development is obviously, it's paramount when you're working as an SRO, but a lot of law enforcement officers and law enforcement administration, sometimes they have a disconnect there. So when you have these relationships prior to incidents, then you take away all that conversation of what's best, what's not best, because you've already built the trust. So when the superintendent comes in and says, this is what I need, the administrators go from the police side, say, okay, how can we make that happen? So we did that. And again, it comes down to relationships, building the trust, because we're not experts in child psychology. Most law enforcement officers do not understand it. We police kids and we do the job that we need to do. But understanding where they're coming from and their perspective and what they need as kids, not what we need as adults. We need to understand that they're kids that need support and have been traumatized. We need to be there and understand it from their perspective. And again, so it's the trust of the relationships, I think, are absolutely necessary between law enforcement and school communities. Because if you don't have the trust there, then you're not going to have a relationship at all.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And, Bridget and Jeff, you experienced an incident of, community violence that spilled over, if you will, into the schools. Heather, you did as well. I'm so excited to segue over to Nnamdi, who we know, does a lot of work with higher schools that experience community violence. Nnamdi, what would you say are some of the biggest challenges that community members face as they work through those phases of recovery from an incident of school violence? And how does your organization support schools and individuals with recovery?
Our organization, Children and Families First, is a statewide nonprofit, and we partner with our various school districts and other nonprofits and faith-based organizations. And basically, we have support services, and I guess sadly, our reality here in Delaware, especially in Wilmington, the city where I reside and live, we have high incidence of gun and community violence that often spills into the schools, or the impact of it spews into our schools. So we work through our community schools program to strengthen the lines of communication between our home, schools, and community, to provide the supports in awareness. So if there is an incidence of violence in the community, we ensure that the schools that are the feeder patterns for that impacted community, that they are aware. And then we place therapists and social workers inside of the schools. We also have mobile therapists who respond and support families. And we work along with our local law enforcement, as well as at school-based, our SROs. And it's an array of therapeutic support services from individual to group to art-based therapy, just an array of supports that we try to provide. And just working holistically and realizing that the trauma that is experienced within our community, that it touches everyone, and we try to bring everyone into the healing space to make sure everyone that this is everyone's concern. And from the various aspects from our superintendent to our bus drivers and our janitors, that everyone has a role to play every day to support our students. And that's how we try to go about building teams of supports that are in our community and also linked to our schools.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And a major factor of recovery, as we've been sharing, is supporting students and staff who are working through, trauma and re-traumatization. So Heather, can you tell us about some of the supports that it would have helped your recovery journey and how they informed trauma-informed practices that you now integrate into your classroom?
I think the biggest thing that helped me was acknowledgement in some way. There's an idea called disenfranchised grief, and it's how grief that's not acknowledged by society. And I feel like being acknowledged in whatever way really helped me. And this also helps in my classroom today because, as I mentioned before, the shooting went wholly unacknowledged, really. So in my classroom and at my school, I made a very concentrated effort to acknowledge people's grief and acknowledge people's experiences. After the shooting at Columbine, we received these blankets from this organization called the Linus Project, like Linus from the Peanuts. And so we got these blankets that were a symbol of like comfort that we had, and I still have mine. And so I contacted that group and asked if they would bring blankets for my school today, just to acknowledge these students of like, we understand and we know that you have been through something, and here is something tangible and just like literal comfort in the blankets. In my classroom, I teach English, so we read books that might have activating content. And so I just kind of acknowledge it head on. I model when I'm feeling activated and maybe my heart is pounding a little bit. I kind of acknowledge it with the students, and we practice grounding techniques, tapping. I got origami stuff so they can fold origami if they need something to keep busy with their hands. It's kind of hard, I think, for teachers to model that and lead that because it can be really uncomfortable, but it's really helped the students to feel more comfortable and feel emotionally safe in the classroom as they recover.
Thank you so much, Nikki. I'm sorry, Heather. And Nikki, you spoke about this a bit earlier, and thinking about, the trauma and traumatization and compassion fatigue that educators and other recovery support staff might experience. So can you talk a little bit about some of the supports that were offered to staff and to students in the aftermath, and who were some of the partners that you called on? And how are you perhaps still supporting teachers even 2 years after the incident?
Yeah. Well, we have tried a lot of different things. And what we have found is that there is certainly no one size fits all answer. Every community is different. Every school district is different. And so it took some navigating to figure out what our staff needed, what our students needed. One of the primary goals was to really initially establish or try to establish a sense of safety and security when students came back to school. Even throughout summer school, we did have, going back to what Jeff mentioned, should we have school, should we not have school? Our event took place on the last Tuesday of the school year, and then 2.5 weeks later, we started summer school, and we struggled with that decision. Should we do that or should we not do that? But we did realize that students ultimately needed support. And in a community that is rural and lacked resources, we knew that school was going to be the primary place where we could provide the best support for students. And so we partnered with a number of different agencies, both community agencies that were already here, our Educational Service Center from San Antonio provided a number of volunteer counselors to come in. Communities and schools did a tremendous job helping us support students on summer school campuses. Every campus that hosted summer school had a care center that was full of volunteers, people that just supported them, loved on them, listened to them. Our PTO really stepped up to provide additional support, meals, and the Linus Project, as Heather mentioned, they provided blankets as well as a sense of, or just to provide just a sense of comfort for students. And that was so appreciated, all the donations and the love that we received. When students came back to school, we wanted to make sure we had an accurate pulse on how they were doing. And so we implemented an app. All of our students in Uvalde are issued iPads. And so we embedded an app called Rhythm on every student iPad, and that provided everybody with an opportunity to give a daily check-in. And they selected an emoji face to let us know how they were feeling. For those students who were dysregulated, we made sure that a counselor responded to them and provided opportunities for them to just share what they were going through. We brought in comfort animals, which were tremendously helpful. We made sure that we had comfort animals on every campus throughout the district for the first several weeks of school and brought them back at different times throughout the year. We increased our counseling staff and provided them with training in evidence-based therapies. We opened those training sessions up as well to our community-based counselors so that we knew that everybody was kind of speaking the same language in terms of the different types of therapies being offered to students. We provided mental health days to our staff because we knew that many of them were going to need additional time off aside from the normal personal leave days. So we just tried everything, and we are continuing to figure out what works best for the majority. We've sent out surveys. Those have been constant. But I think one of the most impactful things that we did was we brought in a team of staff from Sandy Hook who visited us, 10 staff members who were present on the day of their tragedy, who 10 years later are still there. And the feedback I got from our staff was that there was nothing more impactful than hearing from another group of individuals who had been through exactly what we had been through and could really, really understand what we were feeling. And it provided a sense of normalcy. They were able to say to us, this is exactly where we were a year out. This is where we were 2 years out. And 10 years later, this is where we were. So it really provided a sense of hope.
It's really beautiful to hear the ways that, all of these different entities, at the national, local, regional level came in to support you all. And, also having, as you said, that kind of expertise of individuals who had experienced similar incidents before. So I think it's really a perfect segue into the next part of our conversation. We know that emergency operations plans are evolving guidance documents, and that we can use lessons learned from not only incidents that we experience at our individual schools and within our districts, but from others to enhance our plans. And so with that, I want to turn things back to Jennifer. I would love to hear some of the promising practices, Jennifer, that you've seen at recovery sites that schools can consider as they work to integrate and update their emergency operations plan.
Yeah, thanks, Janelle. And thanks to everybody who's shared your stories. There's so many good lessons learned. I'm going to broaden emergency operation plans to talk about prevention in general, because my strong belief is that if we can prevent it from happening, that's where our energy is best situated. The number one thing I would invest in is a positive, connected school climate, those relationships. If those are in place, we've heard, I think everybody mentioned the word relationship, and I think that's for a reason, because it helps foster connection and healing. It can help prevent an incident from happening because we might notice that somebody's struggling, but it also helps foster healing and provides a platform from which to recover when we have strong connections. So that would be kind of the first piece. In a little bit more nuts and boltsy kind of way, establishing data systems ahead of time is going to really help facilitate your recovery process. So making sure that there is some form of triage and screening system that you have in place in your district to know who was exposed to trauma and at what level, and to be able to monitor symptoms going forward will help you prioritize and organize your response to make sure that you're, as Heather mentioned, you're providing immediate support to your most impacted students and staff, and then sort of able to allocate resources accordingly in your district. So, but after an incident is not the right time to establish a new data system. So that can go ahead of time. I also think that to the extent possible, that any sort of preventative tip line, behavioral threat assessment process that you have in place, that is integrated within your larger MTSS system. Those are often sort of siloed systems, and we put in place support plans for students that may be displaying concerning behavior, but we don't follow through on the management plan for that because it's not connected to a larger system. So I think the more we can integrate Bridget talked about multidisciplinary teams. Bring all of the teams together and talk through how do we best support our students? How do we identify when a student or somebody in our community is struggling? How do we get them access to meaningful evidence-based care before we get to a crisis situation? And then have your data systems in place. And then this is sort of a state, maybe a regional level. I don't know how much this sits at an individual district level, but the last thing would be every district that we've supported has needed supplemental staff in the wake of an incident. And some of that is extra substitutes. Sometimes it's counseling staff. It's people to provide whatever and whenever it's needed. And those people need to be pre-vetted and sort of pre-identified. But can be part of your emergency operation planning as well as just identifying what local resources exist. If you anticipate your local resources being overrun with a larger scale incident, what telehealth supports exist? Where can you pull other resources in so that you're thinking ahead of time about where those additional resources might come from in the wake of an incident? Those are a couple of ideas.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. A wealth of great ideas shared today during this panel. We will segue just in one moment to our Q&A session. We hope that you all stay on for that. But before we do that, I want to turn things back to Nnamdi, who is going to share a poem with us at this time.
Thank you. And as one of my other hats, and I am, along with my twin brother, we are the poet laureates for the state of Delaware. And as a licensed social worker, I've worked ever since I was a kid myself, working with children. And this was a young lady from our community who, unfortunately, her brother was murdered, and he was murdered right up the street from her bus stop. And she, from an honor roll student to just someone who could barely wake up in the morning, she was so just touched with trauma and grief. And it took just an array of social workers and support to help pull her through it. And this poem I wrote for her in one of those dark moments she was in, just to show her that it wasn't you, it was something that happened to you, and we're going to be okay, we as a community, and definitely you as a person. And it's called Tuesday's Trauma. Every day I live in a world full of gray, a fog of disbelief, of haze of dark days full of grief and grays. My mind replays what my heart can't delete. I can't eat, I can't sleep. I just keep seeing my brother there lying in the street. My mom is depressed and always upset and stressed. And no matter what it is, she's just tired of our mess. And she's been like this ever since my brother's death. See, I'm from a home that's severely broken, where words are vomited rather than spoken, trauma masked by hurtful emotions. I look in her face and I see pain all over the place. Some emotions are left best unexpressed. So I sit in silence, sad music in the air. My auntie said that my mom needs to go talk to somebody, but my mom says she doesn't feel like talking to anybody. She just doesn't feel like going back to work. So now she's behind on all the bills, falling deeper into depression. Now she's back to taking those pills. I look my mother in the eyes and I see a face I no longer recognize. I live in a place where laughter no longer exists. And I know as an honor roll student, I'm supposed to be stronger than this. But as my smiles disappeared, so did my strength. But they want me to show up to school like everything's cool. But my bus stop is right up the block from where my brother was shot. So by the time I get there, I'm just not in the mood. And no matter what they say, they're just going to light my fuse. So I'm staying home again another day unexcused. Things have been wrong for so long, I doubt that they will ever get right. See, this is the impact that gun violence has had on my life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nnamdi. Again, thank you to all of our panelists. This has been truly a powerful discussion that we've had today. I do want to share a few quick key takeaways. And honestly, there were so many takeaways. This is definitely not all-inclusive, but I think it's important to think about how you're going to prepare your staff for supporting both mental health and academics, and supporting the mental health of not just students, but also staff and the whole school community. Understanding that the road to recovery is long, and sometimes that it may never end, and it's going to show up in different capacities at a different time. taking time after an emergency to revisit the emergency operations plan and use lessons learned not only from emergencies that you experienced, but those of others. You know, Marlene mentioned the Principal Recovery Network, and we talked about a lot of other entities that can provide that support. And also consider support for students and staff in schools not directly affected by an incident. And I think what Heather shared really highlights the, you know, the importance of that as well. So again, thank you so much to our panelists. Now we'll close the formal delivery content of this webinar and we'll move into our live Q&A. Again, we appreciate all of your time today and thank you for all you do to provide safe and supportive learning environments and communities that are free of gun violence. So with that, let's go into our Q&A session. If I can have all of my panelists rejoin me. We do have a few questions that came in during the event that I would like to address. I'm going to turn this first question to Marlene. Has there been a correlation between school violence and teacher retention and/or overall teacher turnover? Marlene?
Well, there's certainly been oral reports from teachers who have seriously questioned whether or not they could continue being teachers. I know that there were news stories and surveys that were done after particularly Parkland, the tragedy in Parkland, where teachers said, I can't do this. You know, understanding the kind of community that Parkland is, it's very much like Littleton. I mean, it's a beautiful place. It's surrounded by nature. And it was declared the safest city in the United States in the year before the shooting. So with that, in that regard, but I don't know that there's really been, you know, true research.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wong. Another question here, and I'm going to turn this one to you, Jennifer. Can you offer any advice on getting staff to be more empathetic to the trauma experienced by children when they have been traumatized also?
Yeah, it's a challenge. I think it's really important though to lean into supporting staff. I mean, I think when you hear a teacher say, I'm not ready to be in front of my students, we have to listen to that. And we have to provide support to help get them ready. In my experience, most teachers want to be back with their students and support their students as soon as they feel they're able. But what they aren't sure is, how do I talk to my kids about this? What do I say to them? How do I support them? What do I do if a kid gets upset in my classroom? And so in the wake of the Lewiston shooting in Maine, we did provide some on-site support to some schools. It looks like similar to your example, they did a delayed start, but we went in and facilitated conversations with staff before the kids came back, where they were able to share just their own experiences and how they were feeling and what they had gone through over those couple of days. And then we were able to provide just a couple of little strategies for teachers to know what to do when their kids came in, how to talk about it, how to even reference it. What do you do if a kid starts to get upset? And that gave teachers both the space to acknowledge how they were feeling and some tips and strategies to feel more confident. Teachers know what to do. We know how to support kids, but we lose our confidence when something like this happens. And sometimes it's just important to be able to say to teachers, you know, your kids need love today, and to be able to provide some love to them in that space. So I think there isn't really a way to kind of turn on empathy, but I think providing empathy to teachers in that situation and providing some skills and strategies has been effective in the districts that we've supported.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Heather, I'm going to turn this next question to you. We have a participant who said they're most interested in how to best care for self when continuing to teach. And so I think you might be able to speak to that from the perspective of a teacher.
Yes, I can give at least what has really helped me through this. And truly the thing that has helped me the most is professional trauma therapy. I started it 20 years after the shooting at Columbine and did EMDR and brain spotting. Those were the therapies that worked the best for me. Also really like you can't help other people unless you help yourself. And so you've got to find ways to do that. And the best way for me was really acknowledging that I was traumatized, because I feel like as a teacher, you're really just going to be like, no, I'm fine. I can do this. I got to push through for the kids. I got to be there for the kids. And so just really stopping and examining that. And I do 5 minutes of yoga every morning. I go for walks when I can. I mentioned therapy has been really, really helpful, but truly it's really about connecting with other people who get it and who have been through it. And I am actually going out to Oxford in September, I think, to meet with their staff to see about like their recovery journey and connecting with other people who get it. So really, that self-care thing, I know it's kind of a buzzword, but try all the things and find what works for you.
I know that Marlene's ears are probably ringing right now. Here at the REMS TA Center, we offer a Resilient Strategies for Educators training. Marlene, I'll turn it to you in case you want to mention anything about the self-care plan that's a part of that training.
Yeah, this is an excellent training that REMS provides at no cost to educators, schools, school staffs across the country. And embedded in that is the most recent science about, supporting resilience in students and especially in teachers, because, I think that leadership is not necessarily trauma informed. And before teachers can help children, we've got to give them the opportunity to sort through what they've been through, what their experience has been, and to give them some skills and knowledge about how to provide what we call psychological first aid. And that is taught in the REMS. It's introduced. It's not really a training per se, but the concept of it is introduced as part of the training. And this is something that's been around since 1957 through the American Psychiatric Association, who said people who get support, acknowledgement, just as you were saying, Heather, like it happened. And instead of, saying, well, you weren't hurt, you weren't shot, to understand that trauma is an invisible wound and that is real. It's as real as a physical injury, and it's as hurtful, and it can be very destructive. So I think that kind of training and giving teachers that time. Yeah, should a school be shut down? I think it should be shut down for a few days so that the teachers could meet together with SROs, with the school nurse, with the mental health folks in the school, with all the resources that are there on days before the shooting and now days after the shooting. And I am a big, big proponent of SROs. It's both visible, and also if they're excellent SROs, they're role models for kids, and kids need that. So, I just think that providing those skills and knowledge is very important. So teachers do have tools, and there is like a protocol for talking with children that is focused not on therapy, but on returning to the classroom and supporting their resilience.
Thank you so much, Marlene. And we have one final question that I will just answer. One of the participants wanted to know if there are any resources, template, checklists, etc., to help schools create a post-event plan. I do want to note that the REMS TA Center, we offer an online course on after action reviews and reports, as well as additional resources on that topic. And it might be helpful as you are exploring how you can sit down when the time is right, as Jennifer said, to kind of think about the lessons learned, think about what was done, what could have been done better, and to use that to update your plan. Again, thank you so much to each of you who have joined us today. I do want to share that there is a link for the feedback form that you screen in one moment, and we do encourage everyone who attended today to just take a few moments to provide us with some feedback on today's session. and to share what topics and formats do you prefer for our upcoming sessions of the series. In addition, please visit the website where today's presentation will be posted. You can listen to an archived version of the presentation or share it with your colleagues who may have an interest in this topic. But again, thank you to all of our panelists, to all of our contact setting presenters for joining us today. Thank you to our participants for the great questions that you posed. And please know that we are here to provide support, and we're happy to be on this recovery journey with each of you. So thank you so much.